David Edgar is one of the most important figures in British playwriting in the last 50 years. And this would be true if it were only his plays that we were talking about. He emerged as a tirelessly prolific writer of often short political plays, often agitprop, in the early 1970s. And agitprop was a deliberately crude, direct, funny, and impersonal form. And by impersonal, I mean it was widely thought, I think, in left-wing theatre circles of the early 1970s, that bourgeois theatre, with its emphasis on individual psychology, was profoundly conservative because it was an ideological distraction from the true levers of history, which are economic. And Edgar once said, and I don't think it was a joke, that he had at one point dreamed of writing a play in which there were no characters at all, and everyone just played things like, and I quote, a graph of labour migration from the Northwest during the 1960s. But interestingly, he began to feel limited by the form around the mid-70s, I think, finding that the relentlessly economistic Marxist view of the world that agitprop conveyed very well missed the importance of consciousness in the political movement. In this, he was partly influenced by the rise of feminist theatre, in which the slogan that the personal is political acknowledged that the personal, the sexual, the individual had an important place in sort of political consciousness. Indeed, that consciousness had an important place in political consciousness that agitprop seemed unable to wholly convey. And didn't a theory of socialist transformation require a sense of how people would come to experience the contradictions of capitalism, understand the need for change, and choose to make that change? And experience, understanding, and choice are all arguably psychological phenomena. Discuss. Edgar felt that a more complex analysis of the state of society and its politics could be offered by a form that combined the analytical clarity of agitprop with the psychological acuity of naturalism. And so the State of the Nation play emerged, a theatre form in which we followed individual characters, but through an epic terrain spanning sometimes decades and continents, as we come to understand the dialectic between the individual and history, between psychology and power, between the personal and the political. And Edgar was one of the key figures in developing this form. He wasn't alone in it. Howard Brent and David Hare and others also wrote plays in that area. But Edgar's are certainly some of the best of this form. His 1976 play Destiny was about the rise of the neo-Nazi party, the National Front, in Britain in the mid-1970s. But Edgar's play begins in partition-era India in the late 1940s, and it makes its way to the present, placing the urgent threat of the far right in the context of capitalism, of some of the failures of liberal democracy, of the end of empire. His play Maydays, originally 1983, but revived 35 years later in a revised form, is a stunning account of the drift of some people from the radical left of the 1960s to the radical right in the 1980s. And its protagonist, Martin Glass, is as rich and contradictory and compelling a character portrait as in any play of the period. The State of the Nation play has evolved in Edgar's hands, and even if later plays don't always cross decades to tell their stories, Edgar always writes with a breathtaking intellectual and narrative scale. You can see it in his trio of Eastern European plays, The Shape of the Table, which was about the negotiations that ended the communist regimes of Eastern Europe, a play that premiered, it's slightly incredible to think now, in 1990, while these events were still unfolding. There was The Prisoner's Dilemma from 2001, which looked at conflict resolution in that post-Berlin Wall era. And sort of between those, perhaps his greatest play, Pentecost from 1994, a beautiful piece that starts as a play about the discovery of a fresco in an Eastern European church, but then turns into a political hostage drama. But on the way asks sort of extraordinary and vast questions about the history of art, about the way we understand Eastern Europe, about the fate of refugees, and the fundamental value of telling stories. More recently, in 2011, Written on the Heart, his gorgeous play about the writing of the King James Bible, showed how flexible and lyrical his epic dramaturgy could be. And of course, we should always have known that, because it was his ability in the State of the Nation plays, I think, to marshal massive amounts of material into robust narratives with huge opportunities for bravura theatricality that led the RSC to ask him to do the adaptation of Nicholas Nickleby in 1980, which was a huge commercial success for the company, later televised, and then went on to have a huge impact, I think, on RSC Productions. I think you can see it, the impact of that production in Les Miserables, for example. And of course, he hasn't just written vast plays about public politics. I've always rather loved his small-scale domestic play, That Summer, from 1987. I think an autobiographical play about a middle-class left-wing couple who take in two daughters of striking miners for a summer. His more recent play, Testing the Echo, from 2008, is a light-footed collage play that explores Britishness and citizenship in scenes by turns kind of witty and paradoxical and confounding. And then in 2018, this usually journalistically impersonal writer put himself center stage in Trying It On, a one-man show that he performed himself, in which he engages in dialogue at 50 years distance with the young, radical David Edgar of 1968. It could have been awful, but it worked beautifully. Edgar addressing and displacing himself through a process of really quite unflinching self-examination that then became a kind of reflection on the history of the left since the 1960s. And I say, if that were all, he'd already be a major figure in British playwriting, but he's also been a tireless campaigner for playwriting. He was a founder of the first proper playwrights union in Britain, the Theatre Writers Union, through which he was key in negotiating some of the rights that playwrights now probably take for granted, the right to the integrity of your work, so that people can't just rewrite it without asking you, to be credited for your work, and to be paid to attend and do work in rehearsals, and much more. And he's continued to kind of work behind the scenes with the Theatre Writers Union, later with the Writers Guild, refreshing and updating and reinforcing those rights. He set up the first fully fledged MA in playwriting at the University of Birmingham in 1989, which has produced a huge number of very significant playwrights. He wrote an excellent book about and called How Plays Work. He's championed the playwright in articles, talks, books, and indeed in reports for the Arts Council, in some of which I have been lucky enough to collaborate with him. David is a tremendous playwright, a legendary figure in British theatre, and I'm delighted to have a chance to talk to him about his work. Hi, David, how are you?
Not too bad, how are you?
Yeah, pretty good. I've just assembled a garden chair, in case you're wondering how vivid and exciting my life has been.
Well, in no doubt, conscious homage to the end of Edward Bond's Saved.
Exactly. That was on my thought the whole way.
In which that is the most, Saved is almost irresponsibly optimistic, you wrote, referring to that very incident.
How are you? How is lockdown for David Edgar?
You mean apart from the dreams and the memory losses and the sudden, inexplicable and unjustified but temporary outbreaks of terrible Phrygian doom? It's fine. I mean, we live in a reasonably large, comfortable house in Birmingham. We have a very nice garden. Our route to the shops is via a park with a lake. I mean, we are. I mean, move to Birmingham. I mean, it's a. We are so much better off than other people. But I've sitting at home all day is what I usually do, and I'm slightly surprised by my lack of resilience actually about it. That I'm not sleeping wonderfully well, and I am having these vivid dreams, which I think everybody is reporting having, and it's quite striking how I did a lot of plays. Not a lot of plays. I've done 2 or 3 plays about people in forms of solitary confinement.
Yes.
Including one about a guy who's in solitary confinement in prison in South Africa, and I've read quite a lot of books. And there are some interesting common factors actually about just the sense of deprivation of novelty. We have a colourful house, but a sense of wanting bright things, of really enjoying the sunlight, because it just makes things look brighter. So I think we are in confinement, even if in our case it's pretty comfortable.
So what I'd like to do is, in sort of first part of this chat, talk in general terms about your writing, your process, how your plays come into being, and then maybe we'll focus on a specific play. And I want to just start where I'm starting with everyone, which is kind of where your plays begin. And by that, I suppose I feel with you they must begin with a political issue or a political event or a social issue or something like that. But what is the moment where you go, and now I see how a play can come out of this? Or what's that process?
Yeah, certainly it starts with subject matter, which is a deeply unfashionable thing to say, but they do. I mean, almost everything I've written has it's the play about the National Front, it's the play about political defection, it's the play about the Reformation, it's the play about citizenship, etc. So that's where it starts, and I think I think if you thought about it for a long time and you researched it for a long time and you didn't start getting excited by dramatic ideas, then you'd drop it. And I think the dramatic ideas can be quite different. They can be in Destiny, which was a play I wrote about the rise of the National Front in the 70s. The idea was that it should be set during a by-election, which is a fairly obvious idea for a play about politics. That it should be set during an election. But the idea that 4 of the crucial characters in the story should have been together in India on the night of independence in 1947, and that those 4 characters should come back, including one Indian character who became an immigrant to Britain. And I think that was, and it started actually by reading that Enoch Powell had burnt his major's uniform the night of Indian independence, and I thought that was, although Powell isn't a character in the play, I thought that was a very kind of significant moment, and there's a character who's quite close to Powell, and so that was the starting point for that. I mean, there've been other plays in which the idea has been more obviously, but even a play like Written on the Heart, which is about the making of the King James Bible, and very much about the making of the King James Bible and as a way of looking at the Reformation. The idea of a conversation between one of the lead translators of the King James Bible version in the first decade of the 17th century, a very establishment endeavour, lots of bishops, and a conversation between him and William Tyndale, who wrote the first English translation printed English translation of the Bible, nearly 100 years before, reappearing as a ghost, and that there would be a conversation between a man and a ghost for half an hour. There's also an element of sort of ideas that have a kind of theatrical chutzpah about them. And there's an immense speech towards the end of the first act of actually no longer, sadly, in some ways, the first act of Maydays. And I thought, a 3-act play, and you have a 10-minute speech just before the first of 2 intervals. I thought I had to sort of kind of chutzpah about it. So so yes, there must be and I think also a kind of principle which might be about a process. So there was, I read a play called The Shape of the Table, which was about the 1989 and the overthrow of communism, and it was about the content, but the principle was that basically the same thing had happened 5 times in all the countries except Romania, which was rather different. In that there was the same kind of process, it just got faster and faster and faster. So Poland 10 years, proverbially, East Germany 10 months, Czechoslovakia 10 days, and as it were, the way to understand what had happened and the conflict between the old and the new that occurred would be to as it were, take all the body parts from those, particularly 3 actually of the 5 revolutions, and kind of assemble them into a generic. And I did that again with a play called A Prisoner's Dilemma, which was about peace processes, where I drew on Bosnian peace process. It was set in former Soviet. It was one of the 3 plays I've written set in the former Soviet Empire, so it was drawing on Bosnian Kosovo peace processes, but also on Northern Ireland and South Africa, and particularly the Middle East. And again, sort of taking the interesting bits and putting it together and making something generic, and playing with fire, which was about the riots, the Northern race riots of 2001 in Bradford, Burnley, and Eldham. Again, I looked at all 3 of those and created a fictional sort of Frankenstein body parts build from all of those. So that's a kind of idea of how to do it, I guess, and you'd need that before you started.
And you mentioned this idea of the theatrical chutzpah, which is a great phrase for it. I suppose I'm thinking that you will be thinking about all sorts of political and social events all the time. Are there any kind of issues that you just instinctively know, or just feel, I just don't think I could see any theatrical way of looking at that? I suppose in my mind, I'm thinking the way that lots of playwrights struggle with how you deal with the environmental crisis.
Oh, well, I was going to say, yeah, the environment, I think, is, for 2 reasons, the environment is a bad idea. One is that it's difficult to do, and the other is that Steve Waters' The Contingency Plan is a sort of cornered the market, and I think it was being revived. I can't remember when it was being revived, but I hope to God that's being postponed, not cancelled. The revival of that play. So I think the pretty extensive difficulties of writing about the climate have been altered. I actually saw a show at Edinburgh, my favourite show at Edinburgh, which was about endangered species, and that couldn't be more opposite from Steve's play. Very, very simple. One of those great Edinburgh things that had just a single idea, and it was a one-person show, and he visited every conceivable variation on the idea and then stopped. And that was one of the most satisfying things I saw during the 3 weeks I spent at the Edinburgh Festival last year.
Indeed. And with something, I'm sort of interested because, as you say, you start with subject matter, and I kind of think you stay with subject matter in the sense that obviously you're building and shaping and crafting a play, but it feels like it's there to deliver understanding and knowledge and debate and so on around that subject matter. Are there moments in that process that are kind of that you don't understand? And what I mean by that is, for example, Enoch Powell burning his uniform. Do you kind of, is there a bit of you that goes, oh, that's so interesting because it expresses this, this, and this? Or is there a bit of you that instinctively says there's something sort of thrillingly complicated, almost artistically complicated about that idea, and I don't want to understand it? Or do you feel you always want to understand the images?
I mean, I should, of course, say, no, what is most exciting is the things that I find incomprehensible and difficult, and that don't fit. And I think I'm a more instinctive playwright than I sometimes look, actually. I mean, I was thinking about, I mean, watching some of your these brilliant interviews, and I'm very pleased and proud to be a part of that. You know, I feel that there's a lot of talk about that. I think my career as a playwright, in a way, divides with something that isn't a play, which is writing a book about playwriting called How Plays Work. And the reason for that is that up until then, I hadn't thought, but I was brought up going to the theatre a lot. My parents were actually not in the theatre when I was growing up, but my dad was a television producer, and my mother had been a radio announcer during the war, and they'd met on the stage door steps of the Birmingham Repertory Theatre as young actor stage managers in the late 1930s. And so I went and my aunt ended up as administrator of the Birmingham Repertory Theatre, which is, and so I went to the theatre a huge amount, and my dad built me he built me actually a kind of little theatre in the garden, but he also built me a model theatre, and it you know, so there was never much doubt what profession I would. I mean, what bit of it was another thing. So I learnt a lot of stuff instinctively, and most of my writing friends and colleagues, you know, were brought up with cinema or brought up with television. I was actually brought up with theatre, so I ingested a huge amount. And as a consequence, the first line of How Plays Work is first things first, you know all this already. And that was sort of, to me too, that it was basically naming and writing down, particularly naming actually and categorizing techniques which I sort of knew already, and which had been instinctive. And I think what most playwrights do when they write, obviously, I mean, the proverbial, you know, Hollywood moment of tearing the piece of paper out of the typewriter and screwing it up and throwing it away. Why you reject things is because, you know, you don't feel they work. And now what does that working mean? You know, it's basically a set of petrified principles. I mean, petrified not in the sense of frightened, but in the literal sense of something that's been sort of compressed by experience. So when I was writing my early plays, I found them harder to write, I think because I hadn't really understood what I was doing, but I was doing quite a lot because I had grown up assembling a dramatic toolkit from the fact that I saw a huge amount of theatre before I was 20.
And that's interesting as well, because I mean, for the first 4 or 5 years of your writing life, you're writing kind of agitprop plays, or I mean,
Yeah.
not exclusively, but you're writing a lot of those sorts of plays. How far did your upbringing prepare you for that? And you know, because you would think of agitprop as being partly about rejecting bourgeois forms and doing something more direct and punchy and popular or something, or how much actually did your experience of going to the Birmingham Rep and so on, going to the RSC, feed into that?
I think, you know, the theatre in the 60s, I mean, it's not just actually, you know, the Royal Court, but in fact, perhaps not the Royal Court. You know, there was a lot of very punchy stuff. I mean, you know, Oh, What a Lovely War being one example, but a lot. I mean, things like there was a wonderful review about anti-capital punishment play called "Hang Down Your Head and Die," which was done by Oxford students actually, and ended up in the West End. There was indeed Beyond the Fringe. You know, there were happenings. There was Peter Brook's sometimes magnificent, sometimes awful US. And you know there were a huge amount of influences on popular drama, plus the fact that what a lot of agitprop is and remains is satirical. So you are you know, satirizing different forms. I mean, you know, the classic one being the quiz show. You know, scenes in agitprop things which are based or based around a Newsnight interview or something like that. So you know, I was drawing on. I also, I must say, did 2 agitprop plays which were which had an entire kind of frame. So I did a rather silly play about rather ashamed of now, because it was deeply opposed to our joining the then Common Market, a play called Teddarella, which was a not undecipherable satire on Cinderella. But then I did, which I was much more pleased with, a play called Dick the Turd. Yeah. The title was DETERRED, but Deterred, which was a spoof of Richard III, and so you know, that was a piece of agitprop which drew very directly on my experience of seeing that great play many times. And so, yeah, I, in terms of everything except content, in a way, I was very well equipped, and I got equipped for the content by what was happening all around me between the ages of 18 and 22.
And I think I interrupted you because you said that in a way your writing divides a bit around writing the book about playwriting.
Yeah.
How has it changed since then?
Eightborn has a good line, which is that you should understand structure not in order to write your first play, which will, you know, burn out of you onto the page with uncontrollable zeal and majesty, but in order to stop spending the next 19 plays trying to work out how you did the first one. And I think that's a good note. I think my plays from I mean, How Plays Work was written in the late noughts, but it in fact came out of doing the playwriting course at Birmingham from 89 to 99, and most of the ideas in it came up during that period. And I think it you know, it was just it stopped. I think it just stopped wasting a lot of time by flailing about. I felt I was flailing less after that, because I sort of knew the questions to ask of the material and how the material should be dramatized, which I hadn't thought about in quite that way before.
That's really interesting. So if we're kind of imagine, and maybe it doesn't really quite work like this, but imagine a kind of a temporal line that goes from the point where you go, I am sort of mentally committed to this idea that I'm going to write a play about the writing of the King James Bible, or the end of communism in the Eastern Bloc, or whatever it is. You presumably there's a big research phase. Is that
Yes.
Separate? Is that research phase also producing dialogue and characters and scene ideas or events, or yeah?
Yes. Yes. And I know you like to ask about technical things, and I'm about to do something really technical, which will surprise you because it involves sensitive and creative use of facilities on a computer, which, as you know, is not always my strong suit. But Word Perfect, which I worked on from 1987 when I first got a computer until it became impossible for it to be compatible with anything else. I was using a very early Word Perfect 4.2. Has a wonderful facility which people have said you can make work on Word, but you can't really, which is a sort button, which basically sorts things in word order up to 6. So you can, and I use it for research, and I go through books, and I conduct interviews, and I watch television programs, and I do all the things that you do, and I type up all these notes, and then I am, as it were, it's a card index system really, and I'm card indexing as I go, and so the first thing might be, the first time I did it for was Shape of the Table, which is about the fall of communism. And you can start with, say, the country, start with Czechoslovakia, and then you can have communism because the bit is about communism, and then you can have the date of something, and then you might even have a name. And as long as you're doing it, as long as you keep the date as number 3, you can get it to order it in number 3s, so you get a chronology.
Yeah.
And you can, if you do it, if the name is always number 4, you press a button, and everything that's about Havel or Gorbachev or Jaruzelski ends up together. And you can also do themes. And I noticed early on that there were quite a lot of echoes between the form of the protests that were taking place in 1989 in Eastern Europe with the form of protests that had taken place in 1968 and the years either side of it in the West, from the chant "The whole world is watching," which was chanted by in the Chicago the Chicago riots at the Democratic Convention in 1968, and were also chanted in the street demonstrations in Prague in 1989. And the protest of putting flowers either down the barrels or behind the shields of the riot police, again happened in America, outside the Pentagon, happened again in Prague. And so whenever I saw something like this, I'd just start a little thing in which the first name was 60s, and then on I'd go, and then having read, I don't know, 15 books and sort of probably about 30 or 40 bits of stuff, you then have this wonderful moment when you press the button and it sorts it all. Wow. And you look down and you find you've got 2.5 pages of 60s. Right. And then you realize, oh well, that was, and then you find some things that you've just got 2 examples of them. So that was a hare you set racing, which wasn't going to go anywhere. So I do that, and then I also have something that's just called ideas, and then that may get a little more complicated. It might ideas for scenes, and I've got a concept called the format, which is kind of ceremonies and processes, from the most obvious one to weddings, trials, and funerals, where which is so useful in the theatre because the audience knows how they operate and knows the rules of them before they enter the building, so you don't have to explain anything, and we know that obviously most ceremonies in plays are disrupted in one way and another, and what the disruption is, because you know how they should be, and therefore can see how they're being, as I say, disrupted and manipulated. So you might ideas, formats, certainly characters, and so again when you press the magic button, all the things that are about your ideas end up coming together, and then I print them all out because I'm fundamentally an analog person, and I put them in ring binders with those little cardboard dividers, and that occupies many evenings and weekends, and puts off the awful moment of actually having to sit down and write it.
And okay, and then what happens between assembling the ring binders and the moment you sit down and write it? Are you a planner?
I'm a charter, and I write. I've got sort of white pads, plain pads of paper, quite difficult to get hold of now, and I draw. I start off by drawing 2 lines down the middle if it's a 2-act play, which they almost all are now, and then thin lines down the one edge and the either side of the divider, and then scenes, and then horizontal lines which divide the scenes, and then that's the kind of first go at the structure. And I do it in pencil, writing very small. And I do it in pencil because you rub things out, and that means you've got to take a decision, because you can't see it underneath the crossing out because it's gone. And then having done that for the whole play, then I'll do one for each act, and then probably do one for each scene. So it ends up with lots and lots of different pieces of paper with lots of bits of quite small writing on them. And there's a reason. We will. I suspect we're talking a bit about Maydays, and there was but it fits at this moment. 2 or 3 times in my career, I've decided to kind of free up, and thinking this is too mechanical, and in a way, some of your questions have hinted at the idea that David Edgar would be a better writer if he was freer and less constrained. And as I say, I don't entirely agree with that, but on the other hand, I do occasions try and free up, and the 2 more recent ones were with a play I wrote about citizenship tests called Testing the Echo, which was a number of strands of people who were wanting to become British citizens, and I just decided to write without any ideas how they would interact with one another, just write these series of stories of these people and then cut them together. And that was a very David Edgar way of working. It didn't have an interval, it had 65 scenes. It was a very David Edgar kind of play, and I was very proud of it. And my solo show, Trying It On, which I did in 2018 and 2019, again was written in that way, that I just produced material, and then gradually the process was assembling that into a show. The first play, I did this consciously, because I think with the agitprop plays, that's how you just make them. I mean, you don't produce a script and sit down and have a read through. I mean, you just produce stuff. So it goes back to then. But in Maydays, I wrote the first act of Maydays and decided I'm just going to write scenes. And I wrote 2 scenes which were wonderful. I wrote all the scenes, of course, brilliant in every way, but there were 2 scenes which were wonderful in a very particular way, in that they had no place in the final show. The first act was 100 pages long, of a 3-act play, and they're so beautiful, and they just had to go, and they both took an awful long time to write. One was set in America, in Cape Cod, and involved the sort of intellectual life of 1950s American intellectuals, and another was set in Moscow in a flat, and was a lot about the sort of domestic life of faintly rebellious but not dissident people in Moscow in the 1960s. So it's a lot of work, and I produced these scenes, and they're both brilliant. And I said, I'm never again going to write scenes that good that I just drop. So I think from that I went back to doing to making sure that I'd worked out enough that didn't happen. Now, of course, you could argue that the reason why the scenes that remained in the show were as good as they were, if they were any good, was because of those magical scenes that disappeared. Albie is supposed to have written, isn't he, the characters of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? He's supposed to have written scenes of them going to the supermarket and scenes of their external life, knowing that he'd never used those scenes. And that seems brilliant, but it seems a huge amount of labour. And whether or not, how much that helps, who knows.
And in A Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, that there's the character of Brick who drinks, and he says he drinks until he gets the click. And yes. I kind of wonder whether you plan and prepare until you get the click, and then you kind of go, and now I can write. Is there a how do you know, I think I can write this play now?
I think the click's very good, actually. I think there is a moment where it just burns out of you. Somebody wrote in a biography of Thomas Hardy that the things that he would do, I think it was Tess of the D'Urbervilles that it was talking about, just before he wrote Tess of the D'Urbervilles, that suddenly you get lots of letters from Thomas Hardy. And it's because he was putting off starting Tess of the D'Urbervilles. So that bills would be paid. Creditors would say, great, the drink bill's been paid, new novel on the way. And so I think there, and I like start on a Monday and all of that stuff. First thing on a Monday, and so once you've got to Wednesday and you haven't started it again, it's another way of putting it off. But I think there's an unexpected point. There's I'm writing this now. I think does happen, and that's exciting. And the other thing, Dan, is that, every writer knows this. Whether it's hard or difficult, whether a scene is hard or difficult, does not tell you how good it is. It may be, you think, it's really hard, that means I haven't structured it right, I haven't got it right. Or, my God, this is going well, it must be a zinger. And neither of those things are true, necessarily true.
And when you are writing, are you, you've said you would like to start, you like to start first thing on a Monday. Are you quite disciplined? Do you have a routine, habits, things you do?
Yes. I used to be, I think, more because I was quite slobby when I was a teenager and in my early 20s, and so it's one of the things I've done in my life, which isn't instinctive. I'm quite untidy, but I think I'm a tidy writer, though not particularly a tidy person. So I had to work at that. I was not an automatic. I imagine that Jack Thorne was sitting down at his desk at the age of 8, starting his 12-hour day or whatever ridiculous amount of time he takes to produce the amount of stuff that he does so well. But I wasn't. I had to kind of train, and you have rules. I did when I had a period because I lost my wife and I stopped writing for a bit. And when I restarted, I was a play called Albert Speer for the National Theatre, and I remembered that I used to get really angry with myself that you'd spend all of the day faffing around, and then you'd do a really good kind of 4 to 6 in the evening, and that the faffing around was allowed by the fact that by the end of the day I'm going to get something done, and that will stop me feeling so bad. And so I banned writing after lunch, writing the play after lunch. Right. This meant I had lunch at 3 p.m. very frequently, which is later than I'm fairly systematic about when I have lunch. No problem with that. So and I do other stuff. I wouldn't then do drugs or walk the dog or anything, but I would write letters and articles and so on. But so I wouldn't, and that actually worked pretty well. And it was because I was coming back to writing after a period of not writing. It sort of was also a discipline a disciplined thing, which was useful. That's, I think, taking it a little bit too far now. But I try and do an 8-hour day. I try and restrict, you know, the rather ludicrous amount of extramural activity I seem to have collapsed on my life over the years. I try and restrict that to weekends, but that's quite difficult to do. But yeah, I try to be disciplined because I sort of have to.
And when you're writing, are you in your head, are you imagining real people in a real situation, or are you imagining actors saying these words on a stage?
Less and less. In that, I think you less and less to imagining them on a stage.
Okay.
The great, you know, most, I mean, they don't now because they've read all the plays that don't do that. But most first, you know, young writers would like to write like Bernard Shaw. I mean, they'd like to have stage directions which, you know, are completely dirigiste and go on for 2.5 pages. Because you are writing, actually that's why I'm saying this. I'm sure a lot of young writers aren't like that, but I suspect that it's a syndrome that they want to, well, I know this from teaching students, that they write the production. Yeah. And obviously it's become less and less fashionable to write the production, and stage directions have become much shorter and less prescriptive. But also, I think that you know, it is the experience and acknowledgement of the fact that what will happen in the creation of the production will be better if it goes beyond what you have had in your head when you've written it. And so, you know, you have to, I think, insist to yourself that you are not going to prescribe when you don't need to. I mean, that doesn't stop you prescribing when you do need to, but you know, the stage directions are part of the play. I mean, you know, any writer is infuriated by the proverbial and perhaps not proverbial directors who just go through the script, crossing out all the stage directions as if they're not part of the play, and they are part of the play. But you know, I think your trust that something will happen in the rehearsal room, which will surprise you, and in a way, you know, if you know, the mechanical Edgar model actually does mean, you know, that you are, if you can leave space, then actually I'm quite a good writer to have surprises happen during rehearsals. Because do I think this is true? Well, I don't know my characters as well as Robert Holman knows his characters. Right. You know, as a writer who's, you know, absolute, or David Edgar, who are absolute, you know, character writers. Now, I think I write good characters. I think I write memorable characters, but you know, character, you know, I'm an Aristotelian. I think it starts with the action, it starts with the plot, and so in that sense, I'm I'm not requiring, but perhaps requiring, but certainly inviting actors to do exciting and brilliant things with the stuff that I've written. And it's a slightly different topic, but it's over my lifetime, I've been involved, as you know, with writers' agreements, and part of that has been one of the things that I'm very proud of is that we're still the only country in the world in which playwrights have the right to be in the rehearsal room and the right to be paid for so being. And the reason that the payment is important because it says that you're in there doing a job which isn't just protecting your baby. There is that kind of what I call the child protection model of the writer in the rehearsal room, which is you're just there to stop them killing your child. And your child is, of course, the production that was in your head when you wrote it. And unless, you know, as you're not going to be a good writer, and you're not going to be a good actor or director or designer, because if you were, you'd probably do those jobs because they're much less painful ultimately. The production in your head is not going to be as good as the production that you see eventually. It will probably be better than the production in the first week of rehearsals, which is why, of course, you have to, sit on your hands and you have to do all the things that writers learn to do and have now got very good at doing. In terms of understanding there is a process. But if you can imagine this is the production in your head, and this is what you're seeing, particularly at the beginning, it's sort of bouncing underneath it. Of course, if that thick black line misses that, it misses when what's happening goes above what you've written and is surprising and is ingenious and is unpredictable and exciting. Which is one of the reasons that I rewrite a great deal in rehearsal. I mean, Nick Hearn Books has to grab, finally insist that if they're not phoned through today, the changes will not go in the published version. So I do a lot in rehearsal for that reason, and in that sense, I'm an extremely collaborative writer, and like so to be.
And a related question to that, I suppose, is about sort of hearing the voices in your head. That's saying too much already. But clearly, one of the things you're doing as a writer is writing on paper lines that have to be spoken in 3 dimensions. Are you hearing that? Do you read your plays out loud to yourself? Do you speak as you go along? I mean, people do.
I sometimes do that to test things,
right?
But I don't do it. I'm not like Dickens. I'm not sure Dickens was like Dickens actually. It's one letter from, but I don't sort of leap up and speak the lines into a mirror like he's reputed to have done. But no, I do test them. I have to say, doing my own play did convince me, sort of slightly confirm me in an opinion that not all writers are great at inflection, and that I am. In other words, I do know how lines should be inflected to convey the meaning which they were intended to have when I wrote them. With we can talk about the author's intention and that, but I do think there are certain. I'm not a very visual playwright, and so I yield to everybody on what things going to look like. But in terms of how the lines sound, I think I do have some. How the inflection relates to the meaning, I think I'm quite good at that, and I know how that works. And as I discovered that by doing my own stuff and thinking, how difficult would it be to gently and without giving line readings and all of that, explain to an actor quite how to deliver that line to convey what I wanted and it needed to convey. And realized that I was actually writing in a freer way, knowing that I was going to deliver it. This is not to say that I'm the best performer of my own work or anything like it, but that did mean that particular play has quite a lot of really quite delicately modulated things which rely on inflection.
And you said that, I think you said 1987 was when you got your first computer.
Yes.
Did you type? Was it a typewriter before that?
Before that, it was well. I mean, I've always handwritten, and I still do.
You handwrite your plays?
Yes.
But Maydays' first act was 100 pages. You must have got unbearable writer's cramp.
I think, whether it won't have been 100 pages because it was 100 pages typed up.
Oh right.
But I mean, Dan, I did 5 drafts of Destiny on, there used to be a thing called an electric typewriter, which just meant that you press the keys and the electricity took it from pressing it to the full pressure that makes the thing leap up and hit the paper. But this was on a manual typewriter, I wrote. I mean, just the physical labour of that. And I must confess, I can't remember which one it was. One of your interviews when you confessed yourself to having printed out a script and then deleted it from your hard drive in order to force you to rewrite it will give you an idea. Will give you an idea of what 5 drafts of a 120-page play on a typewriter actually means.
So it's the first draft that you handwrite.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, so it's the first draft, and then well, the second draft is obviously, because nobody can read my handwriting. It's all very tiny. The second draft is typewritten, and then I rewrite on top, again in pencil on the drafts, which then you type up, and that's the succession of drafts that happens.
Have you ever tried doing a first draft typing?
I did with the free ones. I did that. I did some of Trying It On, the solo show like that, and I did a play called If Only like that, which was a play about the coalition, making the coalition government, and it was quite a sort of free thing, and I typed that, but I haven't gone back to doing that. I don't quite know why. I mean, it was actually good. I mean, I didn't. The result was fine, and perhaps I should. But I mean, there are rituals and superstitions and all of those things, which God knows. Now I've been an actor for a year with the solo show. God, do I know about putting your left sock on first? I mean, all of that. So I think I would find it hard not to have, the equipment being the white pieces of paper and the propelling pencil with the rubber on the end and the ruler.
Right. And when you get to the computer, what is your font?
I'm Times New Roman. It was only when I realised this controversy was a potent one that I began thinking, what kind of writer are you? You don't even bother what font you're using. But I have, when I get emails, I mean, sort of not day-to-day emails, but sort of important emails which have stuff in them, which you might put into another email, I tend to change it into, I do think that a Times New Roman email is a David Edgar email, but I hadn't quite realised how important it was till you brought it up.
and why? I mean, did you choose that, or was it just the default option on your word processing?
It was the default option.
Right.
I'd love to say that I'd love to invent some elaborate reason for it, but no. I think you said that you thought Courier was more street. I don't think that Times New Roman is less street. Therefore, it's peculiarly suitable for an old codger. No, it's just the one that looks familiar, and it's fine.
Can I ask you about rewriting? How you approach redrafting and rewriting? And I suppose that can either be you've written a version, it's still in the privacy of your own home, but you think, I'm going to have another go at this. But it might also be a later draft that you've had notes from a theatre or a conversation with a director. How do you approach doing that?
Well, the first thing to say is I'm lucky enough to be married to a playwright, and Steph reads everything I write almost always first, and so the second draft will be in response to that, and then there are a couple of other people, not always. I lost one, the composer Stephen Oliver, who died tragically young, used to read everything and was wonderful. And I mean, it's very precious, that, because obviously there is as much bad advice around as there is good advice around, and there are ways of delivering even good advice in a way that's very destructive. So before it goes to anybody who's professionally involved in the commission of the play, it's gone through that process, and then I think rewriting is the great thing about good notes is that they isolate what's wrong. So I mean, a really good note is this bit isn't working, and it could be a strain of the plot. It could be in Pentecost there was a strain of the plot which involved the central characters and other middle of my 3 Eastern European plays, and it was just that there was a past reveal that she'd, as many people in Eastern Europe did, she'd been corrupted in a way by the secret police and had informed on somebody, and that plot just somebody who read it early on said, I don't quite get why that's there, and that came out. Because I'm me, there's a lot of removal of too much research, visible research. But no, so I think it's the good bits of rewriting are the easiest bits. I mean, they're hard to do, but I mean, in a way, the easiest is cutting, and I tend to overwrite. So cutting is a good, and there's something wonderful when you cut something and you realize that what you have then done is you brought 2 things next to each other that should be next to each other. I mean, that's very, very joyous.
Yeah.
And that can happen. And so I think it's moving from the general notes, which can be true but aren't particularly helpful, obviously, to moving into a situation where you're saying this bit has got to be changed, and it can be motivations, and I mean motivations often why is this happening, applying Stanislavskian action and intention, and indeed what's the opposition in this scene, very good, what's this scene doing, and if it isn't doing anything, it shouldn't be there. It should be combined with another scene. I mean, all of that. So I think it's in a way applying. I mean, particularly I don't particularly, but people who burn down their first draft very quickly, I think they're doing in the second draft what a slower and more methodical writer is doing in the first draft. Asking the same questions. But I mean, so whether or not you decide this scene doesn't have to start here, it can start there, or whether or not this scene doesn't work because the mother either has to be present or not present for the emotional dynamics to be plausible or interesting, or obstacled in some way, then that's something you may get in the first draft, but you may not get till the second draft.
And rewriting actually leads me on a bit talking about Maydays, which of course exists in 2 really quite different forms. The version that you wrote for the RSC in 1983, and the version that you revised for the RSC 2 years ago. Starting with the first version, sort of what was the sort of initiating impulse behind writing Maydays?
I'd written a play, I'd written Destiny, which was about the National Front, and so I'd got interested in the right. And of course, I was interested in the right because right-wing people tend to be richer and more higher up the social scale than left-wing people. This used to be the case. And because I come from a conservative family, both my parents voted Conservative, although they were both involved in entertainment, and therefore there was a bit of a bohemian tinge. Nonetheless, I kind of understood, I think, and I went to a private school, and so I understood the soil from which right-wing opinions expectedly grow. Not particularly neo-fascist opinions. But I think I was equipped to try and think myself into the state of mind of people who think things that I find appalling. And I then did quite a lot of reading about both British and the British and American kind of assemblage of the Reagan and Thatcher coalitions, and noticed, my God, the number of ex-communists who are involved in this. In Britain, a guy called Alfred Sherman, who was a Thatcher guru, and of whom Thatcher said, we would not have defeated socialism in Britain if it hadn't been for Sir Alfred. And he'd fought on the communist side in Spain in the 1930s. And in America, particularly the neoconservative, the first generation neoconservatives of New York, Jewish intellectuals, literary, traditionally democratic and left-wing group, who were sort of appalled by the late 60s and the counterculture in particular, and shifted to the right and became part of the Reagan coalition. And a lot of them had been, if they were old enough to, been in adulthood in the 30s or the early 40s, they had been communists or Trotskyites. If they were a bit younger, they'd been kind of beat critics. And they shifted to the right. And I thought, why has that happened? And I began to get interested in political defection and what would happen when that started happening to my generation, which it hadn't at that point. And it wasn't to do so in this country for some time, but it was beginning to do so in France with the so-called Nouvelle Philosophe, who were people who'd been caught up in 1968 and were now rejecting that. And with a number of people who've been caught up in the political movements in the United States in particular. And so I exercised this is another process thing. I thought, I could defect, I'm a socialist, and I could stop being a socialist, and I could return to the folks from whence I came. I could return to my background. I could, I've got all the equipment to do that. And there are elements of British traditional life which I find very appealing. I mean, from the coastline to the cathedrals, and I could see a course. And it was a little bit less than a joke to say I wrote a play about somebody who'd gone to a private school, who'd been caught up in 1968 and had then moved to, who'd been, in my case, not in, but on the fringes of, in his case, in a revolutionary Trotskyist party, and had become disillusioned and moved to the conservative right. That I did that in order to find out how it happened, in order to stop it happening to me.
Yeah.
And oddly enough, Dan, I think that's truer than I thought it was at the time. At the time, it was a soundbite, but it was, I mean, particularly when I observed the trajectory that I had described, applying it theoretically to myself, and then saw it happening with somebody who was actually in many ways quite similar to myself in terms of family background and education and so on, which was Christopher Hitchens, who went through, like 10, 20 years after I'd written the play, the same procedure. And reading his memoir was, oh, I see, yeah, oh, right, yes. So that, I think the reason why it's, if it is an important play, and I think it is, I think the reason it's important is ironically, although, it couldn't be more political as a play, although the subject character does have a sex life, which is unusual for my subject character, it was quite a passionate thing, because it was looking in the mirror in a way that I hadn't really done before.
And of course, the central character that you mentioned, Martin Glass, who is the 68 radical who falls out of love with the kind of communist left, yes, revolutionary left, drifts towards conservatism, and then quite right into the kind of new right. Is he, like you were describing in The Shape of the Table, is he a composite of actual different people, or is he entirely an invention?
Well, no, as I say, he's pretty much me going through that trajectory. I mean, it's the closest. That's not quite true, because of the play called That Summer, which of which I'm also one of the central characters, but in sort of the minor strike. But no, it is very much a thought experiment about what would happen, and there is an incident in it, which I think I remember really happening, which was, and this unusually for me is, the starting with an image, which is a man looking in the mirror and saying things he could never possibly say, just to see how they sounded and how they looked. Right. Saying, right wing or anti left wing things and seeing how they sound. And that actually disappeared, as the first idea often does, from the 1983 version, but in the 2018 version, it comes back. That scene. So it's not very long, but no, it was absolutely. So that's the central character looking in the mirror with all the imagery of the writer looking at himself is the moment when the play ceases to be what actually happened to me and what I was fearful might, or was interested how that might occur.
And was the play an RSC commission?
Yeah.
And were you kind of in dialogue with the RSC as you were writing it at all? Did it develop?
A little bit.
For example, you could have quite a large cast, which is
important. Yeah. It was. It's the ambition that would be that it would be on. Destiny was done at the other place, and at that point, not all of the work that was done at the other place was going to London, but they just opened the warehouse, which was their small London theatre, and my hope and expectation was that it might go to the warehouse, and it ended up in the Aldwych, in their main West End theatre, due to a happy chapter of accidents, but also I must acknowledge, by Trevor Nunn having faith in it. And the fact it would fit on the King Lear set. So my ambition was, when the Barbican was opening, that I wanted to write a play for the Barbican main stage, and that was what it was always conceived to be. So yes, it was and it's an odd play. There's a lot of duologues in it. It works very well on a small scale, and I'm just adapting it for radio, and duologues are very good for radio. And there's more concentration on the central characters than there is in Destiny, and in that sense, it's less good as a big play, because what you want in big plays is scenes where 10 people are firing on all cylinders. You want to watch Succession, and you want to watch the big scenes in Succession. Oh, yeah. Which when they really work are about 8 people firing on all cylinders.
And in fact, specifically, at what point did you know that Anthony Sher was going to be the main?
Quite late.
Oh, right. Okay.
And of course, at that point, Anthony Sher wasn't Anthony Sher, if you know what I mean. I mean,
yes,
he was coming up as an actor, but he wasn't. No, the big. We nearly got Derek Jacobi to play one of the central characters, and which would have been lovely. And Nigel Hawthorne was very interested in Lermontov, so we were actually a bit more interested in the characters that surround Martin in terms of fantasy casting. And then I got a wonderful performance out of one of the great actors of our age.
Yeah. And then in terms of the shape that it took in 1983, which is slightly different from the way it is now, which is these kind of 3 quite substantial acts that are roughly equal sort of size.
Yeah.
How do you remember how that shape emerged?
Oh, I think it's it was Act 1 was going to end with him joining the party. So Act 1 was the big turning point decision. It's what the whole of Act 1 had been leading towards. Is he going to finally reject his family and his past, and is he going to commit himself full time to the revolution? And then the end of Act 2 was going to be in leaving the party, and Act 3 was going to be the consequence of that, when he moved to the right. And then dotted through that was a parallel story of a Soviet dissident called Lermontov. And I was always a bit worried about it, because the reason it was there was because for the conservative right in the 70s, Soviet dissidents were very important, because in the 60s, kind of heroic dissent was a very appealing, well, as it has been throughout the ages. You know, the heroic individual dissenter, or indeed collective dissenter, is a great figure. And in the West, the left had kind of cornered the market in that. You know, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, some of the great leaders of the anti-war movement, and you know, people who were arrested and killed in Chile, and so on. The very much dissent was so. But the only people who were part of a right-wing agenda were Soviet dissidents, and it was right-wing because they were rebellious, and a lot of them, like Havel, said, you know, if I'd been in the West, I would have been on the barricades, you know, fighting the Vietnam War and doing everything that the new left and the left in the West did. But so the fact of Soviet dissidents, it was two things. One, it was, you know, they were the most obvious and personally relatable form of condemnation of the Soviet system. But also they were, you know, made the right able to say, we're the real dissidents. You know, that the left is statist, and, you know, under all the flower power and the clothes and the long hair and the rebellion and the sex, drugs and rock and roll, actually they're the conservatives. They want to bring about a monolithic society like the Soviet society. And so the idea of a Soviet, and I'd heard a story about a Soviet dissident who'd kind of come to this country after a campaign in which there were both left-wing and right-wing people involved to get him out, and he came over here and he was sort of taken over and became a kind, I think not entirely to his disinclination, I would say, but he got a guy called Vladimir Bukovsky, who died recently, and he kind of got taken over by the right, and some of the people who'd campaigned for his release on you know, libertarian grounds, but left-wing people, including David Markham, father of Kika, had you know, felt completely excluded when he came over, and felt that the narrative that had been built around him was a right-wing narrative. So that seemed to me really interesting. But so his story, chronologically, Maydays is quite a conservative play in terms of its chronology, in that it's chronological, and that his story, starting off in he's part of the Soviet army that invaded Hungary in 1956, and that is the start of his kind of disillusion with the communist system, and then he protests, based on a real protest, in 1968 against the invasion of Czechoslovakia. He's then jailed. There's a campaign for his release, and he arrives here in 1979. He gets caught up in the whole pre-Thatcher movement, and he and I was always worried that you would cut from a scene about a small Trotskyite group in Britain to a scene, you know, of people who were, you know, who a guy who's protesting in Red Square and about to be put in the gulag, and then you would cut away back to England, and then you go to a scene with him actually being in the gulag. And I thought, you know, I'm not saying that anything that's happening in these two things is comparable, though they are part of the same story. And when we were, the RSC took a little bit of persuading, but after a little bit of persuading that lasted a little bit of time, they agreed to put the play on to revive the play in the other place, the small Stratford Theatre, and in 2018, which happened to, obviously was the 50th anniversary of 1968, which was the, although the first scene isn't set in 1968, 68 is the sort of start of the main plot of the play. And we wanted to do something imaginative and interesting with the other place, which has a number of different rooms, and they've started sort of moving stuff about. And we thought, why don't the three acts take place in different places? and then we narrowed it down to let's have the first act in the theatre and in the round, because it's the first act is in the 60s and is communal, and in the round seems a suitable way of doing that. And then we would group all the Russian scenes together and all the Soviet scenes together, and we'd do them in the foyer. And in fact, that proved to be impossible for the reasons why things proved to be impossible. But we did actually start the second act with the Hungarian uprising, with people rushing in and people shouting down from the galleries of the other place. And it's always a bit of an agony for me, because I just thought how wonderful it would be if the whole of the act was like this, but we couldn't do it like that. And actually, the set was wonderful. And so we went, then people were sort of marshaled back as if by Russian troops into the theatre, which had changed from being in the round to being traverse, the most sort of lean and linear form of, and quite threatening sometimes form. And then, so the Russian scenes were put together, and then the third act was the third act of the original play, and we came out again. Something again happened in the foyer to bring us back through, and that was end stage. And that was the scenes when he was on the right. Something very weird happened with it. And I'm going to do a little detour. The thing that I think I discovered most when writing the book was about liminal zones. And liminal zones are, as a theatrical concept, come out of Richard Schechner, the great theorist and theatre maker, and his work with Victor Turner, who is an anthropologist, about those areas that we go into at great moments of change in our life. Obviously, the most obvious one being rites of passage, and indeed anthropologically, there are tribes where the liminal zone is a formal institutionalized thing. And that you go and you go in and you change and you come back to where you were before, and you are different. And as we know, probably the greatest theatrical invention of Shakespeare was the Arcadian comedy, in which people start in the town of the court, they go into the country or onto the island or into the magic forest or into Bohemia, and they dress up as other people, and they come back and they are changed, and they enter adulthood. And their entry into adulthood could not be like it is if it hadn't been for that magical experience. And almost always it's outside. There's one exception to that, which is, I think, the Eastcheap, the tavern in Eastcheap, is for Prince Hal the liminal zone, and the Falstaff world is the same world as has the equivalence of the forest and the island and so on. But that form, Act 1 someplace, Act 2 somewhere else where everything changes, Act 3 what they looked like when they get back, has continued to be a model throughout dramatic. I mean, it's the Feydeau farce. Act 1, respectable bourgeois house. Act 2, the dirty hotel. Yeah. Act 3, they're back again. It is two of the wonderful plays of that great period of formal invention, the first half of the 20th century, about which you know much. It's Dear Brutus, by J.M. Barrie, in which the first act is in the country house weekend, the second act is in the garden, and is the life the characters could have lived but didn't. And then Act 3 is they're back, but with a knowledge of the lives that they might have lived but didn't. And then equivalent, The Time and the Conways, the wonderful J.B. Priestley play, where the liminal zone is 20 years in the future. And oddly enough, in this case, the liminal zone is what is true, what actually happens, and then we come back to the first act 1920, third act 1920, Act 2 20 years on, actually not 1940 in what we know about 1940, but and all the dreams have been dashed against the rocks of reality, and that structure I think is really, really powerful. And the reason for that immense detour is that the Russian scenes became a liminal zone. What happened, what the characters in England learnt from the experience of the Soviet Union, and what they didn't learn was made crystal clear by that story being concentrated. Like, you know, it operates. It's only 25 minutes long. The second act of a play, you would go all the way out, come all the way in, go all the way out again. And you've got 25 minutes, and it was electric. It was brilliantly directed by Owen Horsley. And so that served, although it had no common characters at all, apart from just at the very end when we did the flip back to England, it served like a liminal zone. And I had no idea that was going to happen, and it was really exciting. And you know, if I mean, the play will never be done again, its original version, but if it, well, I actually, oddly, the radio version I'm doing is doing that. So we're grouping the Russian scenes together, although in fact the radio version goes back rather more to the original structure in other respects. I mean, we had to do something with it because we had a workshop with some brilliant, 8 brilliant actors, and half were under 40 and half were over 40. And the over 40 people had no problem with it, and the younger people were baffled by the play because of its range of reference. And it was indeed Cuban Missile, what was asked. In other words, the things which for the play were just the contemporary reality everybody knew was now very previous history. And you have to remind yourself, you will come to this, you're 20 years younger than me, but you'll come to this moment. I mean, I have to realize now that there are people I'm teaching, so I'm teaching on a playwriting course at Bristol Theatre School, who were born after Princess Diana died. Yeah. And that's a sobering thought. And that the relationship of a 20-year-old now to 1968 is my relationship to 1918. Yeah. And although I know quite a lot about 1918, I do not know anything like the level of detail that I expected people to know. Oh, 1968. Well, we start off with a Tet Offensive, and then we get the assassination of Martin Luther King, and then we get the May events in Paris, and then we get the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, and then we get the Chicago riots, and then we get Czechoslovakia. Everybody knows that, don't they? No, they don't. And why the hell should they? So we had to find a way of giving the background, and this started life with just me writing down all the things that it would be important for people to know, and which obviously was never going to be how it finished up, and it connected with a way that we wanted to make the play choral, so that it was, I think, 9 or 10 characters as opposed to the 25 people we had in the original production, and there were choral sequences which gave the context for the scenes, and became a kind of argument between the members of the chorus. So people would say, would point out that 1948 National Health Service, but great left-wing thing, but 1956 invasion of suppression of the uprising in Hungary and so on. So it became a kind of conversation within the company, which reflected the conversation that had occurred in the 2 workshops which the RSC was generous enough to give to the play.
And in terms of the kind of the debate, the dialectic, the kind of cultural intervention that I guess the play was trying to make. I went and looked at the reviews of the 83 production, which were generally very, very good. But I noticed that it was very interesting, I thought, that Kenneth Hurren in the Mail on Sunday thought it was a terribly left-wing play, whereas Misha Glenny in Tribune, as you might imagine, thought it was he says right-wing play, but it was a sort of left-bashing centrist play. Are you pleased by that range of interpretations and responses, or do you kind of want to shake them and go, no, can't you see it actually means this?
The Workers' Revolutionary Party newspaper, whose title I can't remember, I think it's called Newsline, was apoplectic about the I wanted to show a process happening which happened for a reason, and was as a result of things that are wrong with the left, which led people into going on a terribly wrong course. In other words, I was trying to rescue, by the question of how Martin ended up like he ends up. I wanted to ask the question as to how we stop that happening, and what the left has to be and do which will prevent that happening. And for anybody who was involved in, as I say, on the edge of, in my case, the Trotskyite left in the 70s, and seeing it almost glorying in moving back to exactly the kind of political practice which had turned the Communist Party of the Soviet Union into what it became under Stalin, and what it to a certain extent became under Lenin. To watch the kind of glee with which Leninism was re-embraced, and then of course to see recently with what I had huge faith in, and was, I think, right to have huge faith in, when Jeremy Corbyn took over the Labour Party, and to see the kind of dreadful factionalism which is so familiar to anybody who was around in the 70s emerge again, and knowing all the reasons why that happened, and knowing the provocations which lead to that happening. But just thinking the awful, I mean, is there something integral about the left? Or is there something, is that a correctable deviation? And so I think that's one of the reasons why the play was quite prescient to bring back when we did, and actually would be even more prescient now, because at that point, I think some of the contradictions at the heart of Corbynism had not emerged to quite the extent they were to do.
David, thank you so much. That was you've been very, very generous with your time. This is by far the longest
I'm sorry.
so far, but thank you. That's so interesting, and really lovely to see you really opening up and being so articulate about your writing. What a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, no, I was just going to say it's always a pleasure. I think the public can know that we work on various things together. And indeed, my solo show, Trying It On, is dedicated to you, because you've been a great influence on my work. We haven't talked about the battles that I've had with the Academy in terms of views about the writing process, but you've always been a doughty champion as this series demonstrates, of the act of the individual writing of a play, and how that is not by definition a reactionary undertaking. And so it's been a great pleasure to spend a lot of time talking about the important things.
Fantastic. Well, I look forward to us being able to raise a glass when we're both out of quarantine.
Wouldn't that be great?
All right.
The rest.
Thank you so much. Cheers.
Love you.